If you were to make a list of North America's top 1.6 professionals, their top 10 or top 20, okay, and you were to write that list down, like the guys who achieved the most, won the most tournaments, had the most prize money, then you were to make a list of the top 20 North American source professionals, the guys who won the most tournaments, won the most money, and you were to write that list down. And then you were to write a list of the top 20 North American global offensive players right now. You would see a huge difference. In fact, you'd probably only see one name out of all those top 20 source players, out of all the top 20 1.6 players in both lists. And that's probably nothing. Jordan Gilbert. None of North America's top 1.6 or like source players who won anything are the top of North America's global offensive scene. Now, if you look at the four major European scenes, that being the CIS scenes of Ukraine and Russia and Poland, and then the Swedish scene and the French scene, if you were to make a list of their top 1.6 players, right, or source players, then you were to make a list of their top global offensive players, there would be a lot more similarities between the lists, right? So, in source, like, top 10 North American source players are like GRT, Laurie, Shaguar, Stevenson, Tripp, Devour, Dafsta, Master Nook, Sunny. You could go on, Dominator, War Machine. Finally, you have somebody like Mo. It's probably the first global offensive name somebody recognizes. Clown, Rambo, Elusive, Paradox, Volcano, Sunman, Adren, AZK. Okay? So the top 20 source players didn't port over. Now, if you look at like the French scene, for instance, say, well, who was like the top 20 players in the French source scene, or the top 10? Well, even the top 5. You have RPK, Existence, Smits, NBK, like Regnam, Shocks. All of these guys, except for Regnam, are in top global offensive teams that are winning majors, right? And you see the same thing in 1.6 as well. So, if you look at 1.6, of course, every country has players that retire. In America, our players either retired or they're at the very bottom rung of like the invite professional scene, skill-wise. The Wardens and the Storms, with all due respect. These guys were probably our top players, Fraud, Sunman, Warden, Shaguar, Method, Tripp, Rambo. Finally, in the bottom of the top 10 for 1.6, you might have someone like Nothing, Moto, K-Sharp, Bullseye, Steel, not the Steel that everyone knows now, Ogjian Steel, Deborn, Dominator, Master Nook again, Irakanji, Fear. So these guys are like, if you look at the top 1.6 professionals, right, who achieved things and won tournaments and got prize money, it's just not congruent to the list of top global offensive players now. But in every other country that's winning majors, it is. You have Forrest and Get Right on NIP, obviously. On Virtus Pro, you'll have Neo and Taz. If you look at the Ukrainian teams, guys who are at the top of the Ukrainian scene in 1.6, guys like Edward or Zeus or Starix or Markelov, these guys are all still on top global offensive teams for their scene going to majors, right? And they're kind of like passing the torch on to these players which we have, players that might not have been great 1.6 players, but players who are like new talent. So you have like Neo and Taz, and then you have like Snacks and Bialy, and to a later extent, I mean, Pasha's a bit of a hybrid. So there's kind of like teams that are structured with torchbearers. There's one exception to this, obviously, and that's Fnatic. But with all the Counter-Strike teams, if you look at the French scene, it has a lot of source talent, obviously. Existence, Smits, NBK, Shocks. So you have Smits, NBK, and Shoxy, who were top 5 Source players in the French scene, all in Envious. And then you have RPK and Existence, who were top 5 Source players in the French scene, kind of with Titan, right? And they're playing with guys like Maniac and guys like Kenny S, and those players, America has those players. They have the Shroud, like our Shrouds and our Terex, right? Guys who were main level, invite, like lower invite level players, IM level players in 1.6 who, when they came onto Global Offensive, they've done extremely well. Okay? But you don't have any of the guys who passed on the torch. And it's not for a lack of trying. It's not like people wanted these players. They thought that these players were good and that they would put these players on teams. Like, these guys got recycled time and time again. They had way more opportunities than other more deserving players, newer players. And I think eventually the North American scene understood, like, okay, we can't try to emulate what the European scene had or currently has with their experience and their history. We just have to get newer players and have them play on, like, the invite level. And that's what's happening right now, which is good. Right? Another bad thing that was happening, another big discrepancy is we just didn't scrim as much as Europe. Right? Europeans had a Facebook group where everybody has Facebook. They're almost always on Facebook. They have Facebook on their phones. And if people want to scrim, they just hit up each other, and they scrim, and they get to it, and it's fine. Like, just as a group that everybody in the invite scene in Europe is connected to. In North America, I think now there is a Facebook group, and people are starting to use it, and apparently there's supposed to be more scrims. So I think right now, as it is now, with all these various talented, semi-talented North American invite teams, what we will see is a lot of competition, and hopefully the competition between them will breed a certain amount of excellence. Will breed teams to scrim and kind of push each other, as opposed to there being one great dream team, which we could also do. Obviously, I think right now is an extreme time of growth and production and struggle for the North American scene, and we'll come out better because of it if we apply the right decisions and mechanics to our game. If we decide to scrim as much as Europe does right now in these upcoming months. Another big thing in general that you see between Europe and North America, other than the historical one, which I started off with, which is like the biggest thing, right? Is Americans really do play for the scoreline. They really do play it like it's a death match. And they don't play competitive 5v5 centered around the bomb. You don't see it so much. It's almost like people are playing for their scoreline because their scoreline is what legitimizes them. Their stats is what legitimizes them. Americans care so much about statistics. It's maybe it's ESPN based. I don't know. But like the way North Americans approach it is, hey, if somebody had a good scoreline and they lost, it's not the guy with the good scoreline's fault. You can't blame him. No way, no how. Even if he made a ton of bad decisions on crucial rounds that lost them rounds, if he got a 3K, he got a 3K, and it's not his fault, right? So I think players that are doing that kind of hold the scene back and they look out for themselves instead of trying to win as a team. So the biggest way that I could probably demonstrate this is if somebody, and I hope somebody takes me up on this offer, if you make a heat map of where North American teams go post-plant, like where each player will individually go by himself post-plant, right, when the bomb's planted in an American site, and then you look at where European teams' players go post-plant, it's drastically different. And the effect of that is not only on the T side, okay, but it's also on like every scrim, every like invite, ESEA, North American invite game. You'll have counter-terrorists in North America going for a retake, and that retake is much easier against North Americans than it ever is against Europeans, because Europeans give them nothing. Okay, they play the bomb. They play very like tight, and they know when to play aggressive, and they flip the switch. The North American players, if you were to look at them post plant, and you were to look at like each player, they push out. They give themselves way too many angles to worry about post plant, and then when they go for a retake against Europeans, it's not the same as when they would go against a North American team and try to retake. So they don't end up winning as many CT side rounds. They don't know why. But that's not the only thing, right? A huge thing, I think, is European teams stressing mid control. Whereas North American teams tend not to stress mid control. It's more like, you know what? Mid is hard. There's all these different angles for me to worry about. My scoreline's not going to be great if I play mid. I want to be a site player and just play the site. Is that fine? Yeah, sure. And they don't play mid together. They don't like take control of mid, CT or T, on it, like any map. So that's huge, obviously, as well. So you have like the history, right? 1.6 and Go players not porting over. Or sorry, 1.6 and Source players not porting over. You have everybody worrying about stats and the stat line too much, as opposed to worrying about like winning the actual round, and to hell with my score line, or my ADR, or my FPR, or whatever statistic is going to legitimize me and keep me playing, because I can't get blamed if we lose, and I get the credit if we win. But on top of that, and the mid control aspect, you have an issue in North America where when North American, and they're starting to figure this out. This is a lot of this stuff are historical problems. North American teams, and I don't know if this is from not watching demos. If you look at Australian teams, I feel like they've made themselves better because they watched demos and they said, you know what, fuck having our own identity. If you're Vox, we're just going to try to play like Fnatic. We're going to emulate Fnatic. We're going to do what Fnatic does. We're going to look at what Fnatic does on a map, and we're going to do that CT side and T side. And to hell with everything else. If you look at like Immunity, they're like, okay, fuck it, we'll just try to play like NIP. The biggest thing though, and I think this comes from the fact that Americans wouldn't have necessarily the ability to have figured this out at some point. If you look at like some of the communication VODs that Adren would put up back in the day with like I Buy Power, or any comm VODs like Katowice 2014, it wasn't the same. And I say this because I understand French, and I had a friend translate Swedish comms for me. My ex-girlfriend was Swedish. It wasn't the same as what North American teams communicate. So North American teams will fall into a default, but when they fall into a default, it's like, what do North American teams say? What are their culture? What is their objective? It's like, okay, everybody just like, let's work picks. So what people are basically doing in North America is they're spreading apart, and they're all trying to individually win their 1v1s, sort of. And if they do, great. You know, they can do something and win the round. And that's like, let's look for picks. Like, just, like, let's try to work a pick. Like, we'll pick somebody off and then we'll work off of that. Whereas North American, or European teams, if you, like, listen to them in French, they're like, okay, classique, like, go into the default, and then they're like, gather information. That's the whole purpose. Like, just, like, make sure they don't push, make sure nothing, like, crazy happens, and gather information. Search. If an opportunity presents itself to you, where somebody, like, you're either going to die or you're going to kill him, then sure, yeah, you pick that player off. But they're not really going out, like, trying to work a pick and pick somebody off. They're just searching. They're searching around an area, trying to get a feel for what's going on, feel for where they're playing, and then they all come back together, and they still have their smokes and some flashes, and they just execute together. And they still have map control, or they maintained map control, and then the second it's like, okay, let's go execute together. If you just look at where the European teams are playing T-side, then you look at where the North American teams are playing T-side, you'll see all the North American players are either all bunched up, or they're all spread out and then they never come back and like bunch up to execute. It's either or. Whereas with the European teams, they're all spread out and then they bunch up almost and they execute and there's like a lurker somewhere and they hit a site and they take it. There's drastic, well, I wouldn't say drastic actually. These are subtle differences that are drastically different, right? That are like, you won't notice them at first, but the impact is powerful. Like a pinprick that has poison on it. So on top of that, if you look CT side, I think the major problem is probably like just confidence and kind of supporting. I see it fine, honestly, with the American teams. Obviously, it's probably more of a mid control problem, needing to play mid together more, flashing more, communicating more. But all these things, I think, are things that the scene right now is currently working on and is currently getting better at. And we're scrimming more. We'll have more competition. We'll have more players playing against each other from different teams and have close games where people have to take it seriously, have close scrims where people have to play smart or they're going to lose. And I think it's going to be a major period of growth for North American Counter-Strike right now, especially with all the money that's coming into the game. And from this period, I think North American Counter-Strike will either find out that this is a good way and we'll get more players in and we'll dominate, or there'll be basically a split where there'll be a dream team. We'll realize that this can't go on and we'll need to do as Fnatic does. Fnatic being, by the way, the one exception to the history rule of like, where are your top, because if you look at like the top 1.6 players in like in Sweden, none of these guys, except for like, unless you call Karen, who obviously has a lot of power in the Fnatic structure. I mean, none of these guys really like are playing for Fnatic now. So DSN, Rolban, or Wally, or Temple, Arky, none of these non-NIP players are playing for Fnatic, but Fnatic is still doing great. And I think if America were to make a team of like absolute competent raw skill players that can like maybe one or two smart players, 3 passive players and like 2 aggressive players, so you'd have like Skadoodle, Shroud, Hiko, right? These are 3 players that are capable of being an LMS. They play different roles in the most part. Like Shroud could go in third, Skadoodle's an opper, doesn't matter. He can do basically whatever's needed to do. He could hold a flank, he could entry, he could search, he could go in second and be like a playmaker, depending on the map. Hiko, probably the best lurker in North America. Then you have like 2 aggressive players, aggressive riflers, like Tarek, and then like Roka or Nitro, who Roka or Nitro could be like an entry fragger. CT side, they can obviously hold their own. Tarek could hold his own. So you have when you have like 3 passive smart players who are all competent and all capable of winning not only 1v1s but capable of like understanding team dynamics and capable of having the right game sense to clutch rounds. You could have site anchors that are very passive, right? 2 site anchors that are very passive, and then a mid player like, for instance, you could have Skadoodle, you don't have to, who can really play, and then you have these aggressive riflers that are rotators CT side and can help out. And these guys would really, if you have these aggressive rotators, like let's say Tarek and Nitro or Tarek and Roka, you could have guys who help out control mid with a player like Skadoodle, while guys like Shroud and Hiko would anchor sites and kind of solo hold sites for the most part, and then the rotators come back and help them obviously. But if you did this right, you'd be like, oh well, who could be the other? Who would they scrim against? Who would this team scrim against, right? And I think that would be the split. Is like it'd be like an East Coast, right? Hiko, Skadoodle, Shroud, Tarek. These are all East Coast players. Roca, New York, and Tarek, New York. These are all East Coast players. And then you could have like a West Coast team with like maybe Sean Gare's coaching and Nothing and Freakazoid and a few other West Coast players. I don't know who particularly, but I'm sure there are players that are West Coast and are pretty good, like Semphis or something. These players could play against each other, and it could be good for North American Counter-Strike, but I think right now we'll have our defining moments. We'll work out our differences, and we'll grow despite not having those torch passers that NIP, Envious, Titan, Virtus Pro, Hellraisers, and Navi obviously have, right? And I think teams that don't have that, like Fnatic and Team Solo Mid, can really be praised, but I think that they gain a lot from being able to scrim against Europe's best, those teams, and they already have all the talent. Like Team Solo Mid has all the talent in almost all, like it's the top 5 players, so they have a dream team for their country, for their scene. I think North America can do that, and I think this will be the biggest growth period if they do watch demos and they do the self-analysis and they say, you know what, what's different? So if you stare at those demos, you're like, what's different? Okay, well, obviously we're trying to work picks as opposed to like getting a default to search for information and then executing, like coming back together and executing. Okay, so there's no map control if you look at North American teams, right? Or if there is map control, they're all gonna just aim duel and 1v1. They don't do map control and then execute. They do map control and like 1v1 aim duel, or they have no map control. So that's a big difference, right? Unlike Europe. Second big difference, other than the biggest historical one, is the fact that mid control is not stressed. So no mid control, alright? So you look at a demo of a European team, you look at a demo of a North American team, there's a big difference with the mid control. You look third, it's like people are playing to get their score line up, post plant. If you do a heat map of European teams post plant, especially Team Solo Mid does a great job of this. They're coming back, they're coming together, they're going, like if a European team were to plant here, everybody would come back this way and like give nothing almost and just really play the bomb. But if a North American team were to plant here, all of a sudden you'd have like one guy playing it smart back here, you'd have one guy coming here for like, for one reason or another, he wants to get a pick on this guy. You have another guy coming out here. Then you have like another guy back there, and they're kind of like, they're all around the bomb, sure, but they're exposed to maybe 4 different angles. Whereas this European team is all back together here, and they only have like the flank to worry about, and then one other angle to worry about, people coming out up to them. And I think that's obviously a huge difference, because it changes how people retake, and it changes how people hold like easy winnable rounds. And I think Europe would respect North America a lot more, and they would just, if you look at European teams, when they play other European teams, it's like 4v3 and they elect to save. When you see European teams play against North American teams, they're like, fuck it, we're going for it. We know they're not going to play smart post plant, we'll get it probably, and they do. And they defuse, and it's like, wow, well, they got like 11 CT side rounds, how'd they do that? Well, yeah, I mean, they got 11 CT side rounds, and like 6 of them they knew how to retake, because North American teams, like, if you give them nothing, they don't know how to retake. They don't like almost retake together. Fourth of all, you would probably just look at North American teams not scrimming as much, but I hope that's changing now, and I think it is. And if we just change these things, we'll strike back. And we'll really show those Europeans what the North Americans are capable of at this intensely logical and beautiful game.